development and democracy. She is engaged in critical efforts for America's leadership and our role in the world, and is today, along with the thousands of people who serve as part of USAID around the world, making big headway against a whole wide panoply of critical changes. I am going to wait for a few minutes for the arrival of the full committee chairman before making broader remarks, but I've just returned from Europe on a CODEL led by Chairman Leahy, and was reminded of just how much of an impact he's had in his service as chairman of this subcommittee and now of the full committee. Let me just briefly review the scope of challenges that we face. An unprovoked and unjustified Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is creating not only a mass refugee crisis into Central and Eastern Europe, but also a hunger crisis, a humanitarian crisis across more than a dozen other countries. An ongoing global pandemic, which, although many of us would like to be done with it, it is not done with us, and we continue to see variants emerge around the world in greater risk to our country and to many others. A warming climate and an increasing number and severity of climate shocks that affect vulnerable communities here and around the world, and a whole series of humanitarian crises that predate the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So countries from Ethiopia to Yemen, Afghanistan to Syria to Venezuela have domestic and regional challenges. We've seen democratic backsliding, the challenges of corruption and development, human rights, rule of law, all around the world. And as a backdrop to much of this competition to the United States and our role in the world and our way of life from China and other authoritarian actors. But I'll say, just by way of opening framing, that I see these challenges as also being opportunities. Opportunities to demonstrate American leadership, to recommit to advancing democracy and human rights in the world, to diversify our partnerships with other development partners in other countries, to increase locally led development, and to work to make our aid more effective and responsive. I commend President Biden for proposing strong investments to address the challenges I just laid out, and to seize opportunities this coming fiscal year for us to demonstrate our role in the world. I am concerned that our needs are far outweighing our ability to respond, given what has been the allocation to this subcommittee over the last couple of years. The President's budget request is 14% above the previous year enacted level. That increase, just by way of comparison, in absolute terms, would be just 1% of our total defense budget. And I think it would be an important head start on meeting our actual needs to address these crises. The budget requests increases for humanitarian assistance, pandemic preparedness, climate adaptation and mitigation, democracy programs, and locally led development. I look forward to discussing these and other elements of this budget request with you, Administrator. We also have to recognize the challenge of getting to a FY23 SFOPS bill. If we are to fail and instead have a full-year continuing resolution, U.S. foreign assistance would be on autopilot. We would fail in our challenge of making strategic updates and would not be delivering on good foreign policy and responsible budgeting. So I also think it's urgent we pass the COVID-19 supplemental for both domestic and foreign needs that was debated, considered, but not ultimately enacted. We continue to face the challenge of billions of unvaccinated people, and in countries where the vaccination rate is below 10% and where we face the risk of possible new variants developing there. So the pandemic, climate change, the war in Ukraine, Madam Administrator, I very much look forward to your testimony today, and I'll hand this over to Senator Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Number one, the increase in funding, I think, is something all of us should consider, given the problems that we have in the world. USAID is a very valuable part of our national security strategy. I see it as part of national security in another form. Your agency is present in some of the most dangerous places in the world. People working for you directly and contractors put their lives at risk, and that is very much appreciated. So I'm a big fan of the concept. We have some differences on family planning and climate change spending and mandatory spending in the global pandemic arena that we'll have differences on, but Generally speaking, the subcommittee, with Senator Coons and Senator Leahy, we've been able to pound out, I think, a good budget and hope to do so this time. The supplemental had $18.9 billion for Ukrainian assistance, $5.458 billion went to food aid, and I'm very interested in hearing about how this money gets out the door on the ground to people who need it as soon as possible so that we can head off a lot of problems. One of the things I think is missing, and particularly Republican Democratic problem, is what is the strategy concerning this part of our budget? And what is our role in the world? Why do we get out of Ukraine? Why are we helping Ukraine but get out of Afghanistan? I'd like to help both. From a national security perspective, it is like 1% of spending. Is it being coordinated in a fashion to get the best results when it comes from our national security? China, we all see China as a rising threat to democracy. How does this program work? What should we do in Asia? The Development of Finance Corporation, how does it interact with the USAID? Half of our problem in Asia is not showing up. The Solomon Islands is a good example where China filled a vacuum. So you can count me in for spending more in this space if it's part of an overall plan. And part of showing up in Africa and Asia is not through military uniforms as much as it is economic assistance and entrepreneurial opportunities. The DFC seems to be is a good concept. MCC is a good concept. USAID. How do all these things work together to get an outcome? So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to trying to not only do a 23 budget, but to make sure that if we do another supplemental, the money's well spent. And to the American people, the combination of wars and famine and climate change, you name it, has led to a historic number of people without food that are going to move to a place where there is food if somebody doesn't come in and find a way to keep them where they live. And this $5 billion we spent was a generous allocation by the American people. I just want to let the colleagues on this committee on both sides all know it's not enough. We'll be doing this again because I don't see anything getting better anytime soon. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I enjoy the committee. I love the work we do, and it's one area in the Congress where I think we tend to come together, and I want to keep it that way.
Great. Thank you, Madam Administrator.
Thank you so much, Chairman Coons, Ranking Member Graham, Senator Durbin, good to see you. Incoming distinguished members of the subcommittee. I am grateful above all for your leadership as chair and ranking, that of your teams. You have an oversight role, but honestly, you have a brainstorming, a collaboration, how do we stare at the puzzle and the predicament of a confluence of crises together and come up with tools that are fit for purpose in the here and now. I really feel like we are one team. I'm grateful for the chance to discuss the fiscal year 2023 President's budget request for USAID, and I look forward to having the chance to wade into some of the issues that you've touched upon in your opening statements. But I think echoing a couple of the points that have been made, I'd like to just step back and try to frame the discussion ahead by starting with the idea that I think it is no overstatement that right now, right here, we are gathering at a juncture in our history, at an inflection point. For 16 straight years, we've seen the number of people living under democratic rule decline. The world is now less free and less peaceful than at any point since the end of the Cold War. And for several years, as we have seen vividly, graphically, horrifically in recent days in Ukraine, autocracies have grown increasingly brazen, claiming that they can get done for their people things with a speed and an efficiency that they claim democracies lack, taking advantage of our open systems also to meddle and that's true of countries with democratic environments all around the world. We see with what Putin is doing in Ukraine just how empty that rhetoric is, just how dark the road to and from autocracy is. Putin's brutal war on a peaceful neighbor in Ukraine, the People Republic of China's campaign of genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. Now, with autocracies on their back heel, now is the moment for the world's democracies to unite and to take a big step forward after so many years of losing ground. If the world's free nations, with the United States in the lead, are able to unite and catalyze the efforts of our allies, the private sector, and our multilateral institutions, if we can marshal the resources necessary to help partner nations and freedom-loving, freedom-coveting populations, we have a chance to extend the reach of peace, prosperity, and human dignity to billions more people. This has been USAID's mission since its inception more than 6 decades ago. And to reiterate, I am so truly grateful to you for your continued bipartisan support of our efforts to save lives, to strengthen economies, to prevent fragility and conflict, and to promote resilience to all of the shocks that we have been discussing already here today, as well as your support in helping bolster freedom and the cause of freedom around the world. USAID's work is a testament to the fact that America and the American people care about the plight of others, that we can competently accomplish mammoth goals that no other country can, and that the work we do abroad also matters to the American people here at home. It makes us safer, it makes us more prosperous, it engenders goodwill that strengthens alliances and global cooperation. Thanks to your past support, the U.S. has helped get more than 500 million COVID-19 vaccines to people in 115 countries. We've led life-saving humanitarian and disaster responses in 68 countries, including Haiti, Ethiopia, and Ukraine, of course. We've helped enhance pathways for legal migration to the U.S. while working to strengthen worker protections, and we've assisted the relocation and resettlement of Afghan colleagues and refugees under the most dire of circumstances, while pivoting our programming in Afghanistan to address ongoing food insecurity and public health needs, and continuing to push to keep women and girls in school. We're also making strides to become a much more nimble agency at a time of immense demands that you've alluded to, shoring up a depleted workforce by welcoming new recruits and operating with greater flexibility, including some that you have afforded us in the recent appropriations cycle. The Biden-Harris administration's FY 2023 discretionary request of $29.4 billion will build on these steps forward, giving us the ability to invest in the people and the systems to meet the world's most significant challenges so that the United States can seize this moment. Last week, with bipartisan support, you passed a nearly $40 billion package for Ukraine that will provide vital assistance to our support of displaced peoples, to the country's recovery, and to the secondary effects on food, fuel, and fertilizer that we're witnessing as a result of the Russian Federation's belligerence. Your bipartisan support for a robust FY23 top line for the State Foreign Operations Senate bill will help us meet this moment and advance American interests and the critical foreign policy and development priorities before us. The challenges, of course, in Ukraine and beyond are significant. Putin's war has displaced more than 14 million people, including 2/3 of Ukraine's children. It has led to serious disruptions to global food, fuel, and fertilizer supplies around the world, further taxing an already overwhelmed international system. Up to 40 million additional people could be pushed into poverty and food insecurity in 2022 due to Putin's war. 2 difficult years of the COVID-19 pandemic have set back development gains, and despite the U.S. leadership in vaccinating the world, leadership which has accrued such benefit to the health of citizens in the countries in which we work, but also indirect benefit to the American people, that job remains unfinished. Multi-billion-dollar climate shocks appear each year with more frequency, and these challenges only compound suffering in places where there are already humanitarian crises, like Ethiopia, Syria, and Yemen. Yet, as grave as these challenges are, I sincerely believe that this opportunity, this moment, this point of inflection provides us a huge opportunity to meet the moment and meet the needs to advance U.S. foreign policy objectives. By providing the resources necessary to seize this moment, the United States can galvanize commitments from our allies and our private sector partners. We can help reverse years of democratic decline, and we can demonstrate to the world that democracies can deliver in a way that autocracies certainly cannot. With your support, USAID will move aggressively to seize this opportunity. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Administrator. And if I might, before I proceed to my question, since this is likely to be the last of the budget hearings for this subcommittee, I just wanted to recognize my friend and colleague and our full committee chairman who for decades has served as either the chair or ranking of this subcommittee. I've just returned from a wonderful trip to NATO headquarters in Brussels and to Davos to the World Economic Forum conference, and was just reminded of the dramatic and lasting impact that Chairman Leahy has had in his role over decades, the high regard in which he's held by our leaders around Europe and around the world, and wanted to thank him for his leadership of this subcommittee. He has been inseparable from Tim Reeser for 33, I think, years on this subcommittee as well. And Tim, from the very first trip I got to take with both of you to Colombia and Haiti and Cuba, I have been moved and impressed by the impact that you've had. So please know how grateful all of us are to your dedication of a lifetime of service to making a difference in the world.
May I add a few comments?
Please add a few comments, if you
can. I compliment you? Well, I hope not to ruin your reputation in Vermont, but I consider you a friend. You probably went down 20 points there. So what Chris said is true. I've gone all over the world, and Senator Leahy's a known figure in terms of the United States Senate. When he speaks, people listen. Tim and Senator Leahy have done a heck of a job affecting people's lives through this subcommittee. And compared to our budget, a small amount of money, but I dare say I've never seen a better bang for the buck in terms of improving people's lives and making the world more stable than this subcommittee. And it's been our harbinger of bipartisanship. I know Senator McConnell worked with Senator Leahy for a very long time. I've had that pleasure, and I just want to echo what Senator Coons said. This has been a delight to be part of this subcommittee. Senator Leahy, you have much to be proud of. Tim, you've worked hard for a long period of time, and I'm sad to see it end. We still got months to go here, but this will probably be the last budget cycle, as Senator Coons said, and it's an appropriate time to say thank you in a bipartisan fashion for decades of service to your community and the world, and the same goes for Tim.
Mr. Chair, if I might just take a moment. I appreciate comments from both of you. I've worked with both of you. We have traveled around the world. I think a number of times Senator Graham and I, whether I was chair or he was chair, the same with Senator McConnell, whether he was chair or I was chair, we passed the Foreign Ops bill out virtually unanimously. Senator Coons, who was greeted by more heads of state than I could keep track of when we were at Davos, and I stood quietly holding his briefcase for him. But we'll do the same thing. I think we're most effective in what we do if we do show the fact that two parties can show the rest of the world the two parties can work together. And I especially wanted to be here, of course, with Administrator Power, who I've known Ambassador, Administrator Power for years and years. And she forgives me for only being half Irish, but I applaud her for what she's done. So thank you both.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator, as we talked about beforehand, and unfortunately we are in a series of votes, so you will see members come and go. Let me, if I might, just start by thanking you for your dedication over decades as a journalist, as a diplomat, as an administrator, to upholding the very best of American values, as I think was the case with my dear friend, the late Secretary Madeleine Albright. It is so often those who come to America from other places in the world initially who believe in us even more than we believe in ourselves, and who help the United States to live up to its greatest aspiration and standards. As you mentioned in your comments, your opening remarks, we have an opportunity here to demonstrate to dozens of countries around the world that we're a reliable partner. But in both COVID and in hunger relief, we are missing that moment as of right now. We just delivered a $40 billion supplemental, most of which is dedicated to Ukraine directly or indirectly. If you would just speak for a moment to how much of that is being delivered through partnerships with local organizations in Ukraine. How much are you constrained, and how much are you able to deliver sort of flexible, adaptable responses, particularly in an environment like Ukraine where there's lots of potential partners on the ground? And what mechanisms are in place in terms of auditing and tracking to ensure that aid to Ukraine is being spent effectively?
Thank you. Well, you'll forgive me if I add my voice to the voices paying tribute to Senator Leahy and Senator Reeser. The two of you are just synonymous with this committee, with the securing of resources for things that matter out in the world for vulnerable people. Just the ethic behind your respective dedication is just, it's the stuff of legend, both of you. And it's been really, really even moving to watch to watch you over the years. Just sorry, because I won't get to see them again in this setting. So, but you just both you care so much. You care so much. And
as so clearly do you.
Well, I do, but I also care about these guys. To be very specific, and I will come and speak in my normal mile-a-minute way when it comes to the substance of what you've asked, Senator. But I just, the legacy of the Leahy Law, Senator, people will be vetting military units in a way they never would have for the rest of time because of that law. It matters so much. People around the world, the ability to get assistance if they have been injured because of unexploded ordnance or landmines specifically. It's because you all cared, because you invested the time, because you built the laws and the structures, and those are going to be here for forevermore. And I think less, sort of easy to concretize, the number of NGOs that have received support, whether it's a crack, anti-corruption NGO, or, some local media, or people who are tracking civilian casualties. There are so many non-governmental actors around the world who got support because you all embedded support for those programs and mobilized bipartisan support for it. And I really, again, credit Senator Graham and other Republicans on the committee for supporting that over the years. But what's so amazing is the lasting effect of that. It's just the ripple effects, because so many of the people who work for and with or are trained by those NGOs go on to serve in parliament or to become heads of state. And that legacy is going to be something, again, that is felt for generations to come. So sorry to get a little extra Irish on you there, Senator, but it's extremely moving, and there's no tribute that can really do justice, I think, to your impact as chairman, your impact as a senator, and that of Tim, who I don't know what I'm going to do when I have no one to call at 3 a.m. Still working in his office. Other staff. Paul, you're gonna, I'm gonna have to be able to find you. We got to keep research hours, but anyway, very grateful to you. Now,
aren't you?
Thank you. Okay, on the substance, you put your fingers Mr. Chairman, on a challenge, and we've got to get the right balance here, and the balance is between wanting to move quickly, wanting to move with proper safeguards in place, wanting to be able to scale, and so that leads you very quickly to, for example, the very large contributions we've made to the World Food Program, UNICEF, the International Organization of Migration, that's working a lot of the protection issues and inside Ukraine and beyond. But we do also want to make sure that the assistance we provide puts the country in a stronger position in the medium and long term. And so what we are seeking to do in the humanitarian domain is diversify our partner base, and that is likely to include several consortia where we work through an international non-governmental organization, and the first of these consortia has already been agreed upon with Mercy Corps, and where they then provide subgrants to local organizations, Ukrainian organizations that are going to be there for the test of time. And the first of those is about $120 million. So again, not comparable to what we're at the present funneling through World Food Program, but even World Food Program and other UN organizations are themselves working with local organizations much more than they have traditionally in the theaters in which they operate. So that's on humanitarian. I think, though, to distinguish the other significant assistance that has been provided, there is a large sum for direct budget support, as you well know, and that is because the Ukrainian authorities' own burn rate in terms of keeping their state going, keeping their country going, is about $5 billion a month. So we've already provided $500 million through the World Bank, a World Bank Trust Fund. There'll be an additional $500 million passing through there, and then with the supplemental $7.5 billion on top of that. That it's unclear exactly what the vehicle is going to be for the second supplemental direct budget support sum, which is significant, but likely the World Bank or a mechanism like it. And that there you have the progress reports. I think it's written into law that every 90 days the Secretary or I need to be reporting on how the Ukrainians are spending that money. The capacity to audit is, of course, there and will need to be done vigilantly. The World Bank is used to operating in environments like this. And then we have our development programming, which is also going to be in part to strengthen Ukrainian actors to do anti-corruption work so that they can monitor our assistance. So again, I think across the board, we have to be thinking in the short term, how do we meet the needs in the here and now, but how do we leave Ukrainian civil society, the Ukrainian government, and the country stronger by virtue of the assistance that's flowing in, not something that vacates when, for example, an international organization departs, which we hope Ukraine is in a position to have that happen sooner rather than later with the onset of eventual peace.
It does seem, to your last comment there, it does seem premature now to be talking about reconstruction, but at the conference the chairman and I were just at, there was a repeated talk by Swiss leaders about their hosting of a conference later this summer, I think in Lugano, if I'm not mistaken, to begin planning for rebuilding and reconstruction. Virtually every European leader or head of state we talked to made some reference to the Marshall Plan, which is, a generation or even 2 generations later, still remembered as a landmark investment by the United States in stability and security. What sort of planning is underway for reconstruction, hopefully after this war concludes successfully with victory? And what role would USAID play in planning or executing that reconstruction? And what kind of budget planning should we be doing around the scale of the need for reconstruction?
Thank you. First, let me say that USAID just in the last week has been able to deploy our mission director back in Kyiv at the newly opened embassy. And why do I mention that in the context of your question? Because it's going to be incredibly important as we transition, as the Ukrainians transition from humanitarian emergency to development, which will include reconstruction, but also reconstruction will happen alongside development, that we have a presence there to be working hand in glove with the Ukrainians. And so we have our local staff, of course, our Ukrainian staff, many of whom never left Ukraine, but those who left Kyiv, many have returned. But But that presence is going to be a very important piece of thinking through what the appropriate structure for the U.S. government is going to be as it relates to the massive reconstruction task ahead. Second, this is going to be Ukrainian-led, Ukrainian-scoped, and right now, USAID's role, both in presence and virtually, has been to support the Ukrainian Prime Minister's office and the variety of ministries that have themselves been tasked to develop reconstruction plans alongside their current programming plan. So, for example, I spoke a couple weeks ago to the health minister, who is simultaneously dealing with the fact that hundreds of health facilities have either been destroyed or damaged. And how do you provide medical care in such circumstances? How do you now train your physicians in trauma and your psychologists and psychiatrists in PTSD associated with conflict? And so the real-time medical and psychological psychosocial needs, and then also developing a plan to be able to present to donors about what the reconstruction of those medical facilities, and how do you, as to coin a phrase, build back better? How can the medical facilities brought back online, take advantage of advances in medicine and in energy efficiency and everything. So each of the ministries is itself embarked upon that process, and our mission right now is to support them and to scope. I think the third point I'd make is just the centrality of the international financial institutions, because I don't think USAID would be budgeted, to manage what could be eventually $1 trillion reconstruction task. But what you'll have are the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has already announced its intention, I think, to lead on this, and the World Bank and other international financial institutions, of course.
I'm almost out of time. Before I yield to the full committee chairman, if I might, and by the way, on that last point, the IMF, the head of the IMF and I spoke repeatedly about SDRs and their potential as a way to help rebuild the financial capabilities of the Ukrainian state. Senator Graham and I are continuing to work to get through the Foreign Relations Committee an authorizing bill, the Democracy in the 21st Century Act, that creates a framework and authorizes new resources to counter authoritarian tactics, particularly disinformation, election interference, digital authoritarianism. Have you had any chance to review that? Do you have any input for me on that and its potentially constructive role in modernizing the democracy toolkit for AID?
Thank you. I think that, first of all, I think that the President's Democracy Summit and the initiatives that President Biden rolled out in December, a summit that is to be followed a year hence with a second summit, so we can drive action in between. I think a lot of the ideas that you saw rolled out there, again, grew out of the collaboration that I referred to earlier, where our teams were in touch, trying to take a fresh look at a democracy promotion portfolio that had adapted over time here and there, but maybe wasn't as fit for purpose as I think we need right now. And so I think that's reflected both in your bill, in the emphasis on everything from election security and the fight against disinformation and the importance of having open digital infrastructure, to the emphasis on corruption programming, anti-corruption programming, which is the Achilles heel of the undemocratic forces, for sure, globally. You will see reflected in our budget, sort of in parallel, I think, to your bill, requests for standalone resources for anti-corruption programming, which I think, again, is a central pillar of this effort. But, again, the democracy promotion community, the efforts that we have made, I think, definitely need to pivot and recognize the gravity and the modern nature of the threats to democracy. And I think that's what your bill attempts to do. That's what the President's Democratic Renewal Initiative does as well. Thank you.
I look forward to working with you more closely on that. My understanding is I'm going to depart to vote. The ranking member will return. Staff tells me that Senator Durbin will act as the chair in my brief absence and is going to question next. Is that our understanding?
Sure. Why not?
Thank you.
Welcome. I'm concerned about Haiti. We've spoken about it before. I don't know if you've had time to read that lengthy series in the New York Times about the legacy of debt and ransom and the treatment of the West in Haiti, but it's a heartbreaking history of that country, which tried to emerge out of slavery and still is burdened by it. It appears that developing a functioning government in that country is a challenge. How do you see it?
Thank you, Senator, and thanks for always caring about Haiti. And it does feel like the world's attention kind of flows in when there's some big event, like an earthquake, or in the recent case of the assassination of the president. USAID is there day in, day out, but I have to say that the political stalemate, coupled with the spiraling violence, kidnappings, the gains that the gangs have made, has made it increasingly difficult for us to do our work. I think we still have partners who are out and about who are willing every day to brave those risks, whether in the health space, in education, or in attempting to do youth programming to pull people, to attract people so that they aren't drawn to gangs. But it is increasingly challenging. I think with an emphasis on security as foundational for development, with our State Department colleagues increasing their support for the Haitian National Police. We are trying to help young people with new citizen security programming. You'll see that reflected, I think, in our, I think it's a $245 million budget request for USAID managed resources in Haiti. And trying to apply lessons in the violence reduction space from Central American countries and elsewhere in the Caribbean to Haiti. I think the biggest challenge, as you know, is on the political front, is how can a broad and inclusive dialogue actually give rise to elections that are deemed broadly free and fair. And there, again, the political process does not seem to be advancing in the way that we seek.
I say it in the most complimentary terms, but NGO assistance in that country seems like a free-for-all. There doesn't seem to be any governmental coordination, countrywide coordination. Tell me I'm wrong.
Well, I think the development gains in Haiti are significant, for example, in the health space. So, think of Paul Farmer and Partners in Health, right? That's an NGO. That's not, that is an incredibly effective investment of resources for every individual who is touched by being provided with quality health care, but also the investments made in training, of Haitian medical students and physicians, so they go on to provide support elsewhere. So, I think the challenge is that whether it's an NGO or an international organization like a UN partner, and they are, of course, very active in Haiti as well, having drawn down the large peacekeeping presence that you and I know well from a decade ago. If you don't have political leadership willing to come together to forge compromise, to get the country back in a cycle in which people get to hold their leaders accountable at the ballot box, and can't get a grip on the security situation, in part because of rivalries among politicians, it's very, very challenging. But again, I think we're not asking for resources that are going to be thrown into the wind. I think sector by sector, we are showing a return on the investment in the socioeconomic realm. But meanwhile, again, these broader structural dynamics have to be addressed by the leadership.
Are you familiar with Philippine Senator Leila de Lima?
I am. I wrote something about her in Time Magazine. She was one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people a few years ago. Been
in prison 5 years. Duterte's vengeance against her politically, now a new regime on the way. Is there anything more we can be doing to help her?
Well, I hesitate to give you advice on political prisoners, Senator, since you and your team have gotten, innumerable people out of jail just by your relentlessness. I think with a new government that doesn't, that itself, wasn't invested in the prior decision to arrest Madame de Lima, it seems like a very good occasion to make a diplomatic push, and I think the ones that are the most effective are executive and legislative branches together operating in unison, so we can follow up on that.
Can I close by telling you that I succeeded a man you knew, Paul Simon, and he made it clear throughout his life and his political life he didn't want anything named after him. He thought that was just an exercise in vanity, and so the only thing I could think to do in his name was water for the world, water for the poor. And we think through USAID and the leadership under many presidents since he's been gone, really established not only water but sanitation in some of the areas of the world that desperately needed it the most. USAID has been a fabulous partner in that effort. I thank you for that. I also say there's a little project that is emanating from a town that I'm honored to represent called Chicago, providing bicycles to Africa, mobility opportunities that transform lives. And sometimes the little things are the big things. Water, sanitation, basic mobility. It just gives people a chance. USAID is the agency I look to when I think of those ideas. So thank you for your cooperation in that.
Thank you, Senator. And just note that the Water for the World Act and our water strategy, all of that has to be tapped now in light of the food crisis gripping much of Africa, many parts of the world, and Feed the Future and the next incarnation of that, integrates water policy, water management into USAID programming. So there's dedicated water and sanitation programming, and then there's the integration, I think, of the spirit of Paul Simon and that piece of law into a lot of our other programming.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Pat?
Thank you very much. And again, Administrator, I thank you for the kind words, and also the kind words to my boss, Tim Reeser. And as you've often heard me say, we senators are merely constitutional impediments to the staff. They do all the work. Senator Durbin mentioned the Haiti article. I know as I read that article, I was just taken with one. I mean, you know this as somebody who's written such definitive things, the amount of work that went into going back through these almost indecipherable paper records and records that the banks and others said didn't exist, and yet they did, and they found them is amazing. But the complicity of the French government and the U.S. government. I've been there, Haiti, a number of times. My wife Marcelle is a medical surgical nurse. She's gone into surgeries and other hospitals and talked with the people, and in French, I might say. But I also look at the last earthquake and went down there. We used the Leahy War Victims Fund because of the number of amputations that had to happen so that you could then give an artificial limb. And seeing a young boy who looks so much like one of our grandchildren learning to walk again, I saw what our people did and tried to help. But the others came from around the world to help. I'll never forget a orthopedic surgeon who came at his own expense from Brussels. and he was going to come there for a month. It'd been now several months, and he'd been helping. And I was speaking with him, and I told him in French how much I appreciated what he did. I'll never forget, he turned to me and just grabbed my arms. And he said, Salvador, pour les enfants, pour les enfants, for the children, for the children. I mean, that's it, the whole thing. I look at people like Sean Penn, who came down as a volunteer and is getting people together and cleaning up things. I did see others, though, in other countries' aid groups, concerned about what kind of an SUV they have to get around in. I was more concerned about what they're doing to help clean up. But since then, I've seen, with all the work that AID and everybody else did, I just see this getting worse and worse. The assassination of the last president obviously involved an inner job, and now how you can go down and help if you're also going to have to pay bribes and everything else to help people. It is so awful to see that, but you also see others around the world. And now we look at COVID. It wasn't very long ago. Nobody knew what COVID was. Now it's killed more than 1 million Americans, 15 million more around the world. Going to infect another 700,000 Americans. A few months ago, almost no one believed that Russia would seek to reestablish control over the country of Ukraine. 44 million people. They've decimated whole cities, bombed hospitals and schools, marked as such machine gun families walking down the street. Then you have drought and other conflicts in Africa. And what none of these articles talk about is the fact that USAID has to respond to almost every one of these because they do have direct consequences on not only the people there, but the Americans there. The president has asked for a 6% increase. That's billions of dollars short of what senators of both parties are going to request from this subcommittee. I mentioned that because I've been urging all the subcommittee chairs, and I know Senator Coons works as hard as anybody, try to do this to get the bills together. I'm hoping people will move quickly to pass all our appropriations bills. You're not helped by a continuing resolution, no other part of government is. So let me just mention a couple of things that you have to do here and there where you're working: prevent famine, stop COVID from spreading, prepare for the next pandemic, create opportunities for Central Americans so they don't become migrants, help countries cope with climate change. So, you've got a full day's work there on those, but what do you have? Do you have enough resources? Do you need more resources? Do you have the kind of partners you need in foreign governments? I mean, how do you deal with this?
Thank you. There's a lot there. The only thing worse than having to deal with that set of converging crises is to imagine doing so without you, Senator, and without Tim Reeser here to partner with. But so I will say that's an additional compounding factor here in this perfect storm. And I guess I'd just say one thing. First, your point at the end about partners. Do you have partners? I think I think that is critical. We view development, we have to view it as three legs on the stool. This is the security piece, the security of citizens. We were just talking about Haiti and the impossibility for so many Haitians even to get from one side of town to the next, or even to get to school for fear of kidnapping, even our own staff at the embassy. Facing just gripped with this physical anxiety. And so baseline, countries need to have security. The Ukrainian people lack it because Putin's decided to wreak havoc on them and their lives. Then there's the economic development piece, which, is where that's USAID's wheelhouse. How do we spur economic growth? How do we provide loan guarantees to small and medium-sized entrepreneurs? How do we provide microfinance to women, which can completely transform communities and families? But the economic and the security piece, and then the third piece is governance and the rule of law and respect for human rights and accountability. And honestly, the lapse over these last years in so many places in this third domain as well. The economic is hit by COVID, it's hit by climate disasters and so forth. Security, we see more and more state weakness, more and more state fragility, thanks to you all for the Global Fragility Act and the resources around conflict prevention. But this is why the emphasis on democracy and governance is so important too, because we need to have partners with whom we can work. And we've seen, unfortunately, in countries like El Salvador and Guatemala, where we're doing really important programming in the communities to reduce violence, to provide support for people who've suffered gender-based violence, to try to spur economic growth, even against the backdrop of a pandemic. But it's really challenging when we go to the private sector and want to draw investment to those countries and are reminded about, how the government has, appointed an attorney general that herself has shut down investigation, prosecution of corruption cases, taken away the security details of judges that are investigating really sensitive cases. I mean, that makes it very challenging. And so I just think for you as a committee and for us as an agency to somehow be getting the right balance between our investments in economics, our investments in crime reduction and physical security, and other agencies do that in great measure, and then governance and the rule of law, and to note that it's no coincidence that a less democratic world is a less stable world, and that's what we're dealing with now.
Let me give you one example with a conundrum, and I don't know what the answer is. After the Vietnam War, we kept basically a trade embargo against Vietnam for 20 years. Two of our good friends, John Kerry and John McCain, urged us to move forward, and I applaud President George H.W. Bush, who worked with me. We brought the Leahy War Victims Fund there, as did a lot of other parts of government slowly opened up. And as you know, Vietnam today is a lot different than it was a generation ago. When I go to a Fulbright school and ask a sophomore young woman who, when she was 10 years old, did not speak English and was learning it through our educational programs, I asked her a question. She said, well, when you stop to think of it, that would be indicative of, and off we went, But now we've frozen billions of dollars for many good reasons in Afghanistan, but the economy is collapsing there. Famine's a possibility. Contrary to what the Taliban said, girls aren't allowed to go to school, I think past the 5th or 6th grade, I believe. I mean, what can we do? What can we do with some of that frozen money to help stop famine and have improve the situation for women and girls, but not have it just go into the hands of the Taliban, or is there any way?
Thank you, Senator. I think our emphasis so far has been very much on flood the zone with humanitarian assistance and avert, what really could still be, and certainly starting about 6 months ago looked as though it really may well become the biggest humanitarian crisis of our time. The UN appeal for Afghanistan was the largest for any country in the entire history of UN appeals, which speaks to the level of need. So we have contributed $500 million since the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban. I was heartened because we really need other donors to step up and for us to be able to leverage our funding to get other donors to step up. But there was a March donors conference where there were pledges of $2.4 billion. And that'll go to organizations like the World Food Program and others who are meeting immediate acute food needs. But at the same time, we are managing to do some development work. Again, we can't, the work that we do cannot benefit the Taliban, so we've needed to come up with workarounds. I think we've been in close consultation with you and your teams about them. And so, our budget request is coming to you now, requesting, I think, $71 million in agricultural funding that we think we can distribute to farmers, including getting seeds and inputs to them to deal with this particularly challenging time accessing fertilizer and so forth. $81 million in economic growth, where it's, again, those entrepreneurs who are out and about. And then something we all have an interest in, $61 million in health and continuing vaccination drives and other health programming, inside Afghanistan. But my bigger sort of response beyond what we as a government are doing or what we can get other donors to do, given the core point that the Taliban, tragically is in charge of the country, is that the economy is in free-for-all. It is people in charge who don't know how to manage the economy. And the reserves, some portion of them, as you know, have been set aside for the people of Afghanistan. The State Department and Treasury Department are in discussions about how the Central Bank of Afghanistan can be strengthened, but also how it can be ensured that it is independent of the Taliban, because fundamentally what the country needs is markets. It needs liquidity. It needs those reserves to be accessed, but it needs a functioning economy, or we will be in whack-a-mole, the sort of stopgap humanitarian business. And there's no amount of humanitarian assistance that is going to be able to meet the needs indefinitely of a people who are that vulnerable in an economy that is that broken.
It needs to allow all their young people to have an education, men and women. I have a vote on it. I'm going to leave. I'll submit other questions for the record, if I might. But again, I appreciate your kind comments and the very kind comments of Senator Coons and Senator Graham.
Well deserved. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Graham.
Thank you very much. So let's just sort of take a quick trip around the world here. How many, there are 27 nations in the European Union, there are 28 countries in NATO. I'm not asking for this today, but on my side, I want to make sure that the Republican Party is out there leading, working with other nations to build up systems to keep all of us safe, keep people fed that need to be fed, and better health care so that countries don't collapse and we wind up having to pay the price of that collapse. You have counterparts in virtually every one of those nations, is that correct?
The substantial donors specifically, but foreign ministers often take both tasks.
Can you do me a favor? You don't have to do it today, but give me some indication of what other countries are doing in comparison to us. Because when David Beasley was here with the World Food Program, he said that Saudi Arabia had given them like $11 million and the UAE was zero. So that kind of stood out to me. I try to tell the taxpayers back home that you pay now or you pay later in these areas. Let's get in on the ground, shape events rather than being overwhelmed by them. But there's also a legitimate concern by all Americans that are we doing this by ourselves? So we got to make the case that other nations are helping, and when they're not, we got to make them help. Does that make sense to you?
It does, Senator.
Okay, all right. So we'll go to work on that Mr. Chairman, and see if we can come up with some dynamic of how the other world, how parts of the developed democracy world is doing compared to us. Been pushing an idea about a global fund for food security. Does that make sense to you?
I think more resources for food security makes sense. We should talk about the modalities, just particularly given some, I think, important positive developments that align with your first question comment, like the World Bank setting up a $30 billion resilience and solidarity fund, the modalities of which we're still digging into to understand how that's going to be used. So something that coordinates bilateral donor assistance, the multilateral development banks, both regional and global, like the World Bank, could be very important. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I want to be helpful there. I want to let the taxpayer know that we're pushing other countries to do more when they can do more and should do more, and we'll say thank you to those who are, doing their part and then some. We sent a letter to you 4 months ago, myself and Senator Risch, regarding USAID's efforts to hunt for and research novel viruses, including in China. We haven't gotten a response. Can you please answer our letter?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now, the bottom line for me about Afghanistan is, can you think of a scenario of where we help the Central Bank of Afghanistan without the Taliban being benefited?
Senator, right now, I certainly see grounds for skepticism, given that the Central Bank of Afghanistan is run by a Taliban minister.
Right.
But at the same time, with the country's economy unraveling, with the central bank for any country,
Let me ask you, was that
non.
a predictable consequence of our withdrawal?
Was what a
That
predictable
the country
consequence?
would fall apart under Taliban control?
Well, I think that there were views that have been
I'm
talked
not
about up
asking-
here
yeah.
that the Afghan forces would be able to withstand.
When you have a list of the pluses and minuses, one of the minuses had to be that the Taliban get in charge of the country, go to hell in a handcart.
I think I can't speak for the president here today, but I think,
I mean,
as you
from
know,
your lane, were you worried about that? If we,
I think all of us who care about the Afghan people, of course, were worried about the consequences that would ensue, with any.
Are you surprised the Afghans, the Taliban, are not letting girls go to school in a robust way?
Well, let me just say that, am I surprised compared to what I thought of the Taliban before they took power? Of course not. That's their worldview. That's their ideology. They made no secret of that. Am I surprised? I'm not at all surprised when they break their word, but they had, in fact, committed to work with UNICEF and other international actors to allow donors to bypass the education ministry to be able to support girls to be able to be in school. And so, as you know, they went back on a commitment that they had made and that we thought we were going to be able to actually continue to support girls in school.
Given their history, I'm not surprised, and I share your concern about the Afghan people. They're living in hell. So if you can find a way to convince me of how we can get outside organizations effectively working in Afghanistan to keep people from starving, I'll be willing to help. So finally, when we look at what's on the horizon through the end of this year going into the next, I hate to be a Debbie Downer here, but 40 countries rely up to 50% of their grain supply comes from Ukraine, and most of them are in the developing world. I don't see the war in Ukraine ending anytime soon. Famines have hit Africa in unprecedented levels. Are we ready for this? We've had a supplemental, but how do we deal with this? What's your advice to this committee? Because, everybody doesn't want to spend any more money than we have to, but I just don't see a way out of dealing with this, Mr. Chairman, without putting some resources in the pipeline. Now we're in with this. America's national security interest are well served when there's a certain amount of stability in the world, but we can't do it by ourselves. So will you pledge to this committee not only to give us sound advice about how we can do more efficiently, save some money in other places, but also how we can push the world to do their part? So what do you see for the next year?
Well, let me say this, Senator, first, just underscoring the premise of your question, which is, according to the World Bank, 10 million people are thrust into poverty for every 1% increase in food prices. And food prices are already up 34%, but, given Putin's blockade of the grains and sunflower oil and other oils coming out of Ukraine, there's no guarantee that has capped. So I'm a former UN ambassador. I very much share the predicate for your whole kind of line of inquiry, which is we need to leverage what we do to get other countries to do more. I do think that the Europeans have stepped up, both in terms of, opening their doors and hearts and homes and resources to Ukrainians who've crossed into Europe. Unfortunately, though, and I'm not sure how closely everybody is tracking this, in many European budgetary processes, the resources to help Ukrainian refugees are coming out of overseas development assistance. And so if you combine that with the cuts that we've seen from the United Kingdom over the last year and what we know are going to be the demands inside Ukraine around reconstruction, but also just around tending to the acute needs of people who are still under siege and who've been displaced, I worry about a shrinking pie, and it places a premium on getting new donors or donors who have contributed. Saudi Arabia was increasing steadily its contributions every year to humanitarian assistance, and then that tapered off and now has dropped. They have made substantial new announcements for Yemen, which is very useful because there's so many needs in so many places. And so, particular countries are going to have particular parts of the world that they maybe feel a closer attachment to. But what everyone needs to do is to do what you have done, which is to recognize that we're in an extra budgetary moment. We are, if we're just, taking money out of our food security programming in order to, to support energy diversification so that people can wean themselves off dependence on Putin's energy, that's not going to work. If we are not supporting journalists who are uncovering the crimes and corruption of their leaders, that's a big loss, because this is a moment in which, when people feel the needs that they are feeling, they have a right to democratic accountability, and we should be supporting that aspiration that they have. So, everything is connected to everything else, and we can't, I know you alluded to this in your opening comment, Senator, I wasn't sure exactly what you meant, but it would be a huge missed opportunity for the United States to give up also on the incredibly effective COVID-19 work that we have been doing. I mean, from your travels, you must see the gratitude, the fact that our vaccines and our PPE and our therapeutics and tests don't come with strings attached. They're not in exchange for, some country doing this back or taking on some debt to us. These are donations. These come out of the generosity and compassion and self-interest of the American people. People understand that connection. But to emphasize food security and give up on COVID, that can't be an option, right? Given that the food security crisis predated Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in part because of what COVID has done to supply chains around the world.
One quick question, I got to go. What's the vaccination rate in Africa? Do you know?
Excuse me. It's around 17%.
Yeah, so we all agree that's low, but I don't see it changing much for a variety of factors. So one thing that people on our side of the aisle think about, Mr. Chairman, is therapeutics, is to keep people out of hospital, get them well as quick as possible. So I hope that, this combination that we're talking about for COVID would look at therapeutics.
If I could follow up on that, Madam Administrator, before my colleague leaves. In terms of the timing of additional funding around COVID, both for therapeutics and for finishing the delivery of vaccines we've already produced, already been delivered, what's the difference if there's an additional several $billion for COVID relief, for therapeutics, and for vaccines? What's the difference between that happening in June versus September versus December?
Well, Senator Graham, I know you have to go, but I hear you on the low vaccination rates, but I don't hear you, or I hear you, but I don't agree that we can afford to embrace a fatalism around the ability to dramatically lower infection, hospitalization, and death rates. And I actually think we started this initiative called Global Vax with your support in December, which was aiming to put shots in arms, not just, COVAX was delivering the vaccines that the American people donated generously. We've committed 1.2 billion vaccines in total and gotten 500 million out there. But it turned out that once the vaccines began flowing, the best laid plans that many countries had for vaccine delivery were overcome by Russian disinformation, by cold chain challenges, by the absence of accessibility for pop-up clinics. And so we have met those gaps in the infrastructure in the countries that we've been able to afford to provide delivery support to. And that was the Global Vax Initiative. To your question, Senator Coons, I think that right now we are continuing the work in the 11 surge countries, and we are seeing the results. I mean, you're seeing vaccine rates that were 18 of eligible adults that were 18% in December in a country like Cote d'Ivoire, up to now 38% of eligible adults. So, and I could go country by country where we are surging resources. It is working. To your question, we will not be able to expand that to some of the countries that are in Africa that are under 10%, and where we have begun to plan with those countries to receive new resources to train health workers or to get them to be able to work overtime or to have the pop-up clinics. But nor will we have the resources for what Senator Graham was talking about, which is therapeutics and an ability to try to wrestle to tame COVID when you have an outbreak, and we know there will be more outbreaks going forward. I think if we were to, in a sense, what you would see is our vaccination drive ground to a halt in around August of this year, if that $5 billion supplemental is not appropriated, in the next month or two.
I'm expecting one more senator, and then I have a 4:15 event at the White House I'm trying to get to. So we're just a few quick back and forth if we could. The DFC's role in supporting regional vaccine manufacturing, do you see that as holding promise and being something that we can possibly stand up and make more effective? You've got a request for $6.5 billion in 5 years in mandatory spending for global pandemic preparedness. What are the key elements of that? And then to what extent do you think we can work together to craft more flexible and sustainable public-private partnerships around hunger, pandemics, and conservation? I'm happy to repeat those. Let's go one at a time.
Okay.
The DFC has taken on a role in helping finance regional vaccine manufacturing. So, for example, in South Africa, there's another site they're possibly developing in Kenya. Are you supporting those efforts, and do you think in the long term boosting regional vaccine manufacturing is an important investment?
So in brief, we are working very closely with the DFC on this. I think that we would like to see more promising initiatives in the pipeline than we currently have. I think the next investment, USAID provided a grant funding for the Louis Pasteur Institute in Senegal, which I think is probably next up, where the African Development Bank, the World Bank, and now the DFC are also looking to come in. So, I think it's important, particularly as here, attention has receded a little bit from COVID, that we think of vaccine manufacturing structurally, not just about this vaccine at this time, but about the fact that 99% of Africa's vaccines, even prior to the pandemic, came from outside Africa. And so it's a structural need.
Any input you can briefly give me on the $6.5 billion 5-year mandatory? Like, what would that accomplish? If I think about the things that you could do with more funding and that you won't be able to do if we don't get you full funding, providing predictable global pandemic surveillance and preparedness, both for the public health workforce and for sustained resources, would strike me as near the top of that list.
Indeed. What it boils down to is, do we want to be in a position to detect viruses before they have become pandemics? Every country has some form of health infrastructure. Do we want it to be stronger, or do we want it to be more fragile? Right. We want it to be stronger. We want lab turnaround times to be shorter. We want communities to be educated on animal to human transitions, zoonotic diseases, and the like. We want the ability to take samples and move them into some of our global health infrastructure at CDC or at NIH more quickly so that countermeasures can be developed sooner. So to your question, it's a matter of taking the global health security foundation that we have in, I think, 10 countries and expanding it to an additional 25. And so that's, we can show the good that we have done in the countries we are operating in the global health security space at this point, and now we need to spread it and scale it, because variants aren't looking, or viruses aren't looking to see where we have a global health security program and where we don't. Right. Viruses are doing what viruses do, and we have to prevent them before they spread.
I'd look forward to a more detailed briefing as we go ahead with this year's process. Public-private partnerships, something that a number of colleagues have asked about, and I think you're getting a bipartisan letter led by Senator Warner. They're looking for flexibility in Ukraine in terms of delivering hunger relief. World Central Kitchen's been brought up to me a number of times as an example of the kind of partner that can flexibly respond to a rapidly evolving humanitarian disaster. One of the things Senator Graham and I have talked about is, and there was some funding in the FY22 bill for this, supporting public-private partnerships for long-term conservation management in Africa. I wondered if you had any thoughts on the FY23 request for sustainable landscapes and for planning around wildlife conservation, wildlife trafficking, sustainable landscapes, and conservation on the continent.
Well, I can't resist saying something about World Central Kitchen, with whom, even though USAID is not a funder of World Central Kitchen, and they have been wonderfully and appropriately successful in fundraising from private citizens and from companies and foundations. We work hand in glove with them, but their ability to get to places, where even the UN hasn't been able to get is really, really admirable, and a tribute to their staff. They also procure locally, and so we are partnering with them in terms of, we have agricultural programs in Ukraine where we're trying to get seeds to farmers so they don't miss the planting season. Jose Andres is involved in discussions about granaries and how those granaries can get emptied so that more supplies can go in. And we've done, just in brief, a wonderful partnership with them whereby Moldova's apples, because we all want Moldova to succeed, tremendous leadership there in fighting corruption and building the rule of law. But Moldova's apples used to all go to Russia. Right. And now that's not happening. And so what did World Central Kitchen do? They agreed to procure apples from Moldova, thereby helping the Moldovan apple industry in order to feed people in Ukraine. So those kinds of, it's not always about, what kind of money does USAID contribute, or leverage with the private sector, but sometimes it's just about knowing what a private sector actor's comparative advantage is in meeting a development or a humanitarian challenge. On conservation, I believe there's already a public-private partnership of sorts underway between us, NASA, Unilever, and Google as it relates to land use forecasting, and actually going to farmers with the data about how they can, in the long run, be advantaged by alternative uses of farmland. But I think there's much more we can do.
There is. Give me 2 minutes on workforce and the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. This bill increases your personnel. Something I've been concerned about is making sure that both the State Department and USAID have the resources to recruit, train, diversify, retain a highly qualified workforce. How important is it that you get the additional $260 million you're requesting for that purpose? And what are the key challenges around your workforce?
It's critical. I mean, first of all, we have to move faster as an agency given the swirl of events and the urgency of all of these crises. And if you take a USAID contracting officer, they are contracting roughly 3 or 4 times the amount as a comparable DoD contracting officer because of the paucity of contracting officers and the attrition over time. We have the largest Foreign Service class in some time that has just entered. It's also the most diverse class. So we're building out those numbers. But you also, Senator, have prioritized rightly, and one of your questions today spoke to this, the importance of working with local organizations so that our investments can be more sustainable over time. The increases that we've requested in operating expenses, a portion of which you granted in this year's, in the 22 appropriations bill, but we need more of, are also used to be in a position to, in a sense, mentor and help build capacity in local organizations so that they can be partners to USAID. So it's a front-end investment that will pay lasting dividends over time.
Thank you. And while Senator Shaheen comes forward, my last question to you was about the African Leaders Summit. I had the chance to meet with a number of African heads of state who had participated in the one previous such summit we held now quite a few years ago. And to be blunt, they're somewhat skeptical. I'd welcome any input you've got about what sorts of plans are being made and what kind of role USAID might take. And then, frankly, I'm going to hand the gavel and the closing questions to my friend and colleague from New Hampshire while I run to the White House for an event. So
thank you.
Just a minute, and thank you for everything you do and for your leadership. Senator Shaheen, when she answers this question, I'm going to hand you the gavel and the closing statement to make about keeping the record open so that I can flee to an event at the White House. So,
thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. So I think what I will say is that food and fertilizer are foremost on the minds of many, many African ministers right now, and certainly many African heads of state. And so in the supplemental, in addition to the $4.3 billion in emergency humanitarian assistance, which of course some of which will reach African acute and vulnerable communities in Africa, I think looking also at the food security assistance and the knock-on effects of the war in Ukraine and how we can utilize some of that food security ESF money in order to help farmers, better target the fertilizer they have, in order to help them supplement the fertilizer that they have with, compost and manure, as the Ethiopian government is now encouraging. So the sort of how do we get through the crisis piece of this, but also how to diversify imports and exports, how to build more resilience. We've been talking about resilience for a long time in the climate space. And we in the United States are talking constantly about supply chain resilience and what the pandemic has revealed about some of the downsides of globalization, the vulnerabilities of globalization. Well, this is another example of that in Africa. And I think what I hear from the leaders that I engage with is a desire for more USAID and more DFC and other support in helping them thicken their ability to withstand what we know are just going to be a growing number of shocks that come at them. And so I think that's a huge challenge, but a major opportunity. And I hear the skepticism, and for sure, but there's also a lot of buyer's remorse about the huge debt incurred by virtue of
China
Chinese
refuses
investments.
to be transparent, refuses to partner with anything like the same, a generation ago. Dozens of African countries had significant debt burdens relieved in no small part through the leadership of Bono and the One Campaign. And the Chinese are doing nothing like that now. And I am convinced that many African countries would still prefer to be close partners with the United States, but they view us as unreliable. And I've heard some significant pushback. I think the vote at the UN about condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in which a significant number of our otherwise close partners on the continent either abstained or voted the other way was meant as a wake-up call for us about our failure, our lack of delivery on vaccines, on humanitarian relief. This is in no way to be critical of you or your agency, but just something I say to my colleagues quite a bit, that we have a moment where we could make that right and where we could deliver and where we could engage. And I agree with you that meeting human needs and agricultural development challenges is a big part of it, but showing up robustly through AID, DFC, MCC, and through other partners, and frankly, re-engaging in UN entities in a way that contests that space are absolutely critical. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you to my colleague from New Hampshire. I look forward to continuing to work with you in the year ahead.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing open so I could get here. I was at another hearing. And thank you very much, Administrator Power, for being here today and for the great work that you are doing and so many at USAID are doing. I really wanted to be here to talk with you a little bit about the Western Balkans, a part of the world I know you know very well. And I had a chance to visit the end of April with Senators Murphy and Tillis. We were in Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo. And I think it's fair to say that, first of all, with respect to USAID, we saw, particularly in Bosnia, heard about some really exciting and interesting work that you're doing there that was very positive. But I, for one, came away feeling like each of those countries had gone backward in terms of their road towards democracy and European integration since the time I first visited each of them. And I think we were all very concerned about what was happening in Bosnia and the fact that I think after the Dayton Accords, after U4 set up the mission in Bosnia and Europe seemed to take some responsibility, that there has not been as much attention to the region as we really need. Corruption is rampant. Their political structures are not working in the way that at least the people we talked to in the country felt were in the best interest of residents. So talk, if you will, a little bit about what more we can be doing there. What more can USAID do to address particularly young people who are moving out of Bosnia? The out-migration rate is significant there. And how do we help address the challenges that they're facing?
Thank you, Senator. Obviously, there's no silver bullet because certainly when it comes to Bosnia, like you, President Biden, has been a champion of Bosnia's sovereignty, its territorial integrity, its democracy for such a long time. I think, we have engaged, intensively because of the risk that really feels quite acute. And I have been traveling back to Bosnia every few years since I left in 1996. Every time I travel back in the past, I would hear Dayton is broken, it's not working. There was always a sense of some kind of political paralysis. But on my more recent trip, which was a few months before yours, it was the first time that I encountered people who actually had packed their bags in the event of a more dire scenario. And that is attributable, I think, to particularly the leader of Republika Srpska, Milorad Dodik, but other political leaders putting their own kind of power grab and their own economic ill-gotten gains above the interests of not only young people, but all of the people of a country that has been through so much and has so much to offer. but the politicians are definitely getting in the way. And so I'm sure you saw some of the same unbelievable anti-corruption and environmental kind of crusaders and the independent media that USAID has invested so much in over the years, and it's still, speaking truth to power, but just power isn't listening in the way that it needs to be. And the idea that Dodik, or Republika Srpska could see fit to secede from, some of these very technical but very important, joint entity, joint, institutions at the time of a pandemic, at the time of spiraling food and fuel prices, at the time of even more severe outmigration from Republika Srpska than any place else in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's just missing the point, right? It's about meeting the needs of the people and giving them reason to stay. And I'll get to what we're going to do about it in a second, but I met with one. I went and played, pretended to play volleyball. They played, and I pretended to play volleyball with a group of young Sarajevan women. And I said, "How many of you see a future for yourselves here in the country?" And not one raised their hand. And these women, oh my gosh, they could do anything. I mean, you could just tell their potential and their dynamism, and all they want to do is go take it elsewhere, because they just feel like, again, political leaders will never do what is required to create the kind of economic opportunities we need. So we're still, chugging away there and continuing to try to invest, moving to you and I talked about this a little bit on the phone once, I think, but trying to support more local government where, just as in this country, we see sometimes partisanship and polarization give way at the mayor or city council level. So too, some of that is happening in places like Tuzla. And so migrating our programming in a more decentralized way. I think the tourism industry, who knew that Bosnia and Herzegovina was the mountain bike capital of the world? I certainly didn't, but supporting actors on the ground to build those mountain biking trails and, again, create jobs. And looking for tourist opportunities that cross lines. I did a joint event with the Minister of Tourism from the Federation and the Minister of Tourism from so-called Republika Srpska, and it was amazing to imagine how many more tourists would come to take advantage of all Bosnia has to offer if there weren't the political gridlock, if people didn't always have a sense that things might unravel. So that's there. I will say that I thought you all showed great foresight in both supplementals in taking also note of how vulnerable these countries are to the current crisis, both because Putin is very active in the Western Balkans, and we're seeing a spike in disinformation, and so we need to be in a position to come back and again support independent media who are telling the truth, or name the disinformation as it's coming out, as we're doing more and more here in the United States. So I think the nearly 31 million in the first supplemental will go to programming across the Western Balkans. There are some encouraging developments. There in Bulgaria and in Kosovo, you have leaders who are pushing an anti-corruption agenda and looking for resources to help on procurement laws and sort of structural reforms that could make also the business climate more attractive, which in turn could have knock-on effects in stemming migration. But again, the psychological insecurity around unsettled grievances and disputes, fundamentally the political leadership across the region just has to act, especially at a time of crisis like this, with the society and the people first in mind. And again, I think there are pockets where that is happening, and nothing like a crisis to focus the mind. And certainly you see in public opinion polling, the moment of opportunity now in light of Russia's aggression, because that has broken through, notwithstanding all of the disinformation. But being there with these new resources to help small and medium-sized enterprises, to help anti-corruption reforms, to help STEM education as they seek to build out their IT sectors. And I will say Kosovo is one example. Last point I make is there's also an opportunity as so many private sector actors leave the Russian Federation, where they might have been able to set up shop. We see every day, the names of new companies who are leading. We at USAID are thinking through, okay, how do we work, for example, with the leadership in Kosovo to try to attract, some of those investments. There just may be opportunities now out of this otherwise horrific crisis that we need to be in a position to move on. And so that's why the additional resources in the second supplemental as well will be very helpful in that regard.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. I think it's also important to point out that, when I first visited the region in 2010, there was a real sense among the countries that I visited at the time, and it included the 3 we just visited, that there was a regional opportunity, that the opportunity was to look to the EU, to NATO, to the West, and to work together. And Serbia and Croatia at the time had a real opportunity to play a very positive role in what was happening in Bosnia. That is still the case. The question is, will they take advantage of it? Will they recognize that it's in all of their interests to look at what's important regionally because it's important to their own countries? And, I think it's incumbent on us to do everything we can to try and encourage that.
Well, let me just say, Senator, last thing, that I'm just so grateful because I do think that the attention generally across our government to this region, of course, the crisis in Bosnia and Herzegovina was drawing attention, the dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo, always generating episodic engagement. But, if I look at Eastern Europe as a whole, USAID did shut down our programming, and shut down missions, in countries like Slovakia and elsewhere in Eastern Europe outside the Western Balkans. And I think this provides us all with an occasion to sort of reset and to say, okay, there are real vulnerabilities here. There are also real opportunities to enlist, more congressional delegations to travel to the Western Balkans. Again, USAID's role to try to broker with diaspora communities as well, more interest in getting engaged. When I came back from Bosnia, I did a big diaspora call and did the same with the Moldovan president, looking at Eastern Europe and again, the shocks that predated the war in Ukraine and now that are stemming from that. So maybe, as people's attention kind of drifted from that period when this was such a centerpiece of American foreign policy, maybe now is an occasion where we can really concentrate the mind, concentrate resources, and I think you alluded to European attention also, flagging. I think the risk of Ukraine is that everything is focused on Ukraine and a very, very fragile situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina could be neglected. But I think at the highest levels, we've been engaging our European counterparts so that any push we make is a joint push, which always makes it more effective.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon. The hearing record will remain open until 5 o'clock on Wednesday, June 1st for any written questions, and the hearing is now concluded. Thank you.